So for as long as I can possibly remember, I've wanted to be a superhero and a mutant, but not any particular mutant, but Storm, right? Otherwise known as Aurora Monroe. I mean, she's one of the most fierce and powerful mutants out there. She can control the weather and the atmosphere at the drop of a dime, right? And she's the first female of African descent that's introduced to comic book series all over the world. And then she later marries her high school sweetheart, none other than leader of Wakanda Forever, Black Panther, right? So how cool is that? She becomes queen consort. She later loses her title because they get divorced, but I digress. I'm not quite sure if it was Storm or if it was a book from my father that got me interested in meteorology and climatology, but it still stands. I heart everything that has to do with the coupled interactions between the atmosphere and the ocean, right? The awe of it, the splendor, the science, the data, right? It's all together amazing, splendiferous, and terrifying, right? And I've done a couple of things within here that gives me a little credence and gives me a little credibility to talk about these things. Now, I've never been on TV, so don't ask me about that, but I've always been behind the scenes. So I've launched weather balloons. I have worked at Dallas Love Field Airport as a meteorologist and manned radiosonde stations and observation stations like you see on the top right, so remember what that looks like. I have routed ships all over the world and forecast the weather for them too. I have done some amateur storm chasing, but never again. And I've also briefly dipped my toes into working in investment banking and what's considered weather derivatives. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the movie Trading Places, but the ending of that is Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy are trying to bankrupt the Mortimer brothers, and they're doing that from a false weather report, right, for the commodity of oranges. And that's essentially what weather derivatives are. But now I work in a space called climate services. Now, I don't want to talk about it right now, but remember that term climate services because I want to briefly go into the difference between meteorology and climatology, right? So meteorology is when you're talking about weather patterns and conditions over 0 to 14 days, because after that, the skill of a prediction gets a little wonky, a very scientific term, and you lose the skill of it. It's not supposed to be 100% accurate. Nobody ever said that it was. It's not supposed to be. So blame the TV meteorologist all you want for an incorrect weather forecast, but things can change at the drop of a dime. And of course, TV meteorologists can't control the weather. They're not Storm, right? And then my favorite ology is climatology. That's weather that's conditioned over a period of time, so different time scales. And it also encompasses really cool things like climate variability and change. And I want to talk about both because you can't talk about one without the other. They are simultaneous. And we often hear the term climate change, but how many of us really hear about the change climate variability? And so I have this wave up here because I'm using a very cool sixth grader approved analogy that I put together to distinguish between climate variability and change, right? So take this wave. So what I want you to do is pull at the peaks and pull at the low parts of it and make it completely distorted, right? Make it a little wonky again, right? This is climate variability. It would exist regardless of climate change that's out there. That means that, yes, you can have a warmer than average winter, and then your next warmer winter can be colder than average. That would just automatically happen, but on average, your winters are going to be cold and your summers are going to be hot, right? But when we talk about climate change, we're talking about those extremes getting even more extreme, right? That means that this starts looking like the previous one, where you do have more extremes. So you have more hurricanes, you have more floods, you have more droughts, and then they become more frequent as well too over time. So your trend is tending upwards, right? And that's where you start thinking about global warming too. So I did talk about my jam earlier, which was climate services, but have you ever really just stopped to understand what is an actual service itself? Right? What is it? We all work in the service industry at some point in time, but have you ever thought about how you can articulate what exactly that is? I mean, there's economic definitions that have to do with exchange of intangible goods, return on investments, etc. But quite simply, a service is something that meets a needs or fulfills a demand, right? And then when I talk about that in this context, so what exactly is a climate service? Well, I'm going to tell you. Climate services, they provide climate information to help individuals and organizations make climate-smart decisions. So usually when I'm working with these people around the world, I'm talking about the health sector, the agriculture sector, the energy sector. In particular, I've worked with the agriculture sector and the health sector. So how can we use climate data for eradication measures and preservation measures with malaria? Or how can agriculturists and farmers know how and when to plant now or when they need to harvest, because climate change has disrupted when you can harvest, when you can plant, et cetera, et cetera. So climate services work because we're putting in inputs, we're putting in climate data, we're collecting that from national meteorological organizations and regional organizations, and we're also using non-weather inputs as well too. So health forecasts, like I was saying before, the timings of when people can plant and when they can't plant. And what that does is we collect all of those things and we transform it into customized products, projections, economic analysis, et cetera. And then we transform that into climate services to help these decision makers, right, throughout the sectors. So that's meaning putting them into charts and graphs or making that accessible via radio transmissions, because people around the world still do use the radio, using your cell phones, and then making these data accessible and free to the public so they can use them for other means whatsoever. So here in the United States, we don't second guess how we and where we get our climate data and weather data from because it's free. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is funded by the government, but in other places, not so much so. So what is hampering climate services from taking hold in the developing world? Well, it's usually accessibility, availability, and use, right? So on the first one, when I talk about availability, I'm actually talking about that data being available. This is held up sometimes by political strife and other things that are going on. This chart in general, this is the average number of weather observation stations in Rwanda from 1981 to 2013. And the drop that you see in 1994 is from the genocide that happened in Rwanda. So there was absolutely no weather and climate data that was being taken at that time, and it nearly took them a decade and a half to get back up to pre-genocide levels as well too. There's also a lack of investment that happens across governments. National meteorological agencies are very low on the priority for getting funded from governments sometimes too. And then there's a private sector crisis. I'm not trying to impede on capitalism at all, but a lot of times private sector companies will come into countries, they'll set up shop, they'll take the data, and then they won't share it with the organizations themselves or the governments. And so there is available data out there sometimes, but sometimes it's not accessible to people whatsoever. And then a lot of the times, the national meteorological agencies have a commercial mandate from their government, so they have to generate their own money in order to keep afloat, right? And there's also lack of access, right? So those national observation stations that I'm talking about, or those weather observation stations, they're the truest form of collecting data because they're the raw data that exists out there. But as you can see in the Sahara and the desert, you can't even set up weather observation stations, let alone have people maintain them because it's hard to get to. And then don't even talk about the Congo and the forested area because you just can't get or even place them up properly at all. And then a lot of times, national meteorological agencies also have extremely restrictive data policies too. As I was saying before, they're tasked on making money. They don't want to give data away for free at all when they need to make that money to keep afloat too. And so a lot of times when you request data from national meteorological agencies in Africa, they will not give it out to you at all. They won't even share it in between their agencies themselves within their departments itself because they think that they have something to benefit from it. Not to mention, they feel that they're custodians of data. They don't want it misinterpreted. They don't want it misused. And there's been a lot of exploitation because of colonialism as well. And then there's the use, right? There's an adage that said, you can't use it if you don't know that it's there. And that's what happens a lot of time. Even when climate data is there, how would you even know that it's there to use, right? So those people that need to use it to do for malaria eradication, the people that do need to use it, the farmers that do need to use it to set up when they need to cut their crops, they don't even know that it's there for them to use, right? And then if you do know that it's there, I mean, meteorology and climatology is very complicated science, and then you don't even know how to interpret it itself, right? And then you can't use it if, like I said, you're restricted from using it as well. And then there's also, in the Met services, the people that want to use it for research services, the people that want to use it in educational services, they can't use it either because they can't pay for it, right? So not all is lost. There are organizations that are putting in the time and the effort to try to solve the problem of availability, access, and use. And one of them is the International Research Institute for Climate and Society that's built into Columbia University. So me and my colleagues have been working across Africa to work with the national meteorological agencies to use the data in which they have and to quality control it and combine it with satellite data and reanalysis data that's for free, and then make it free and accessible to the public, right? So the way in which we do this is, like I said, we combine the free data that's out there. We also have a platform that makes it free and accessible to the public. So it's not the raw data itself that they don't want coming out there, but it's secondary and tertiary products that are there. So maps, graphs, all sorts of things that you can use, things that are conditioned over El Nino and La Nina. You can look at basic climatology itself. You can look at past data. I've been to some meteorological agencies where I have literally seen stacks and stacks and stacks of weather observations almost up to the ceiling, but they don't digitize them at all because, like I said, they don't want people to have access to them, or they don't have the funding to do it themselves. People shift in and out of the meteorological agencies all the time, so they don't have the training that's there. But we're also increasing the use, and we're building up demand from the community by putting these resources out there to them, creating trainings, workshops, what have you, to the community. And so that is how we're accessing the use part as well, too, engaging stakeholders and actually co-producing products with them to let them know what is good for them, because we don't want the savior mentality. We don't want to create something, drop it down there and said, look at what we did, this could be so good for you, and then it not be relevant to them at all, right? So maybe you're thinking, climate services, it's kind of esoteric. How do I even get involved with this whatsoever? Well, we can't all be mutants, right? So we have to get creative about how we're involving ourselves in the weather and climate world itself, right? So remember that all aspects of climate and weather literacy and change are important, right? Especially climate services. So yes, we need everyone in the marches. We need all the Gretas of the world, absolutely. But we need people to understand that all of this, all of the climate change advocacy we have, all of our climate services, the undercurrent of them is free and accessible weather and climate data. So advocate for that if you can. I don't know if you can, but advocate for that, because whether there are public and free houses, whether there are governments, there should be free data. And then when you're traveling next, consider taking a tour of your meteorological agency that's there if you're in a major city, and ask them, how are you making climate services available, accessibility, and useful to vulnerable populations of people? Thank you.